questions around self-isolation, which is coming up quite a lot. What do you do in a situation if an employee does need to self-isolate? Are they entitled to sick leave? Does it depend on whether they're sick or whether they are self-isolating because they were on one of the beleaguered ships we have? What's the situation there?
Yeah, it really depends on what the trigger point for self-isolation is. If I have COVID-19, then clearly I would be able to access personal leave, assuming I have personal leave accruals available. If I've been required to self-isolate because I've returned from overseas, I've had contact with someone that has COVID-19, I don't have a illness or an injury which would trigger an entitlement to paid personal leave. Now, that being said, many organisations are still providing paid personal leave in that situation because the trigger for self-isolation is coming directly from a health directive or it's a directive. It was previously recommendation, but now a health directive to self-isolate. So most employers I deal with are paying it, and it's still relatively small numbers. So it's not been a significant cost impost thus far.
And what about the scenario of people who are, I guess, being called vulnerable people, where they're over a certain age group or they have immune systems that are in significant danger? How do we deal with them? I guess one scenario that your businesses continue to operate as normal. Do you need to continue to provide them with work or not? And also, what if, like, working from home, the various scenarios people are facing?
Yeah, those vulnerable groups kind of fall into two categories. Those that really are identified as being vulnerable because of their age, because of their medical history, because of a variety of other factors. That's a workplace health and safety situation. So like any other risk in a workplace, that needs to be managed. An example, in Queensland at the moment, Education Queensland have indicated that no teacher over the age of 60 will be working in the schools because they're identified as a more vulnerable person and therefore more exposed in a circumstance where there is lots of social interaction despite the social distancing rules and hand hygiene rules that have been put in place within that organisation. You then have another category of employee that are panicked and fearful. They're not at higher risk, but they have a fear of contracting COVID-19 and want to not interact with people and a workplace. That needs to be managed because those fears are real, but there is no specific workplace health and safety trigger associated with that. But in both scenarios, working from home is clearly an option for those roles that allow that to occur.
Thanks, Alex. I guess we're all starting to learn the challenges of working from home. We can hear your dog barking in the background there. So we're all having those experiences. I guess this came up before in terms of Jason flagging, conflicts and performance. And I could see one of our participants has asked about a particular situation with where they shut down their office last week. Small team now working from home offices, like many of us are doing, and they've now discovered on a Zoom call that the staff member left the state to spend time with their new partner in the ACT, but gave no advice. From it's still working from home, but don't know any context, and just feel that the lack of honesty and transparency around that is not what you'd expect from your employee. Any advice from you or maybe Belinda around this particular issue, but also how do we manage people in this new environment that we have where we can't physically see people at all times, and what do we do in terms of managing performance in this online era? Belinda?
Employee taking off for another state. I think that you have to have those, we've talked a lot about having very open and honest conversations with your staff, and probably at this point in time there's no better time to be doing it than at than what we have at the moment. So it's being clear, set the expectations, make it clear to your employees that they are working from home, that you have very clear expectations, set guidelines, set expectations, set indicators, set pieces of work that you want done in a period of time, so that they have very clear goals and they know exactly what they have to do during that time. So, and then obviously check in on a regular basis, you know, be talking, which it sounds like many people are doing already, having those Zoom meetings or Skype meetings or whatever on a regular basis. We would suggest even a daily basis to ensure that people are doing what they need to be doing, and are reporting back to you about what they're actually doing. In respect to that scenario of an employee who's moved to the ACT and hadn't spoken to their employer about it, look, there's nothing legally stopping them doing that, but it's more an issue of you know, the relationship between the employer and employee, and what you would expect as an employer for them to be telling you about that. So I just have that conversation with the employer and say, look, the employee, and say, look, I'm really disappointed. You should have told us that you were going to the ACT, and make it very clear to them that you are disappointed about it, and see how they respond from there.
If I can just chime in and add a little bit to Belinda, you make some excellent points. I think that from a psychological perspective, I just add that transparency is a two-way street, and it's not unreasonable to, in these really tough times where communication challenges are just much more emphasized than what they otherwise would be, that if you are making genuine efforts to be transparent and upfront and open, that you ask the same of your employees. But hand in hand with that, you also need to make sure that there's a sense of safety. We call it psychological safety, that people feel that they can be honest and that it won't bite them in the backside. And you know, you won't just flat out reject a request to go move with their partner that they otherwise might not be able to see for 6 months, who knows how long. So being aware of how this situation echoes through the rumor mill of your organization, how you respond to it, will flag and signal to your other employees how transparent and open they can be with you about their own changes in circumstance. If you really respond adversely and people feel like, oh, I can't be honest about this stuff because I'll get my head bitten off, they may well go to a different state, and they may well just set up a teleconference call against a blank white wall, and you can't tell. And then there'll be these things going on in the background that you won't have visibility of, and who knows what sort of ripple effects that will have on the efficiency of your organization and how well people are communicating. So also, yes, be very clear, set your expectations, 100% absolutely. That is the way it should be done, but also be very mindful of the flow-on effects and how that might be perceived, particularly if there's no legal obligation for people to stay in their home state.
I think that's a really good point, Jason, and particularly when there is a climate of anxiety, I guess, throughout society in terms of job security, because what we do see very often in employment scenarios is where people become so anxious about keeping their job, they start doing the wrong thing in terms of whether it's performance or behaviour, just because they get into this cycle. So I think that's a really good point. And I guess just one of the other questions is about, you know, stay at home, parents who are required to stay at home with their children. And this is, I guess, one of the biggest challenges that politicians are facing in terms of, do we keep the economy going and keep schools open versus safety? And so people are still working, or how can people work from home if their children are there? And I think that does really, as you say, Jason, require a great deal of trust from employers to employees, but really also thinking about the concept of flexible working and how can we work together so that people can manage their personal obligations within their house, be that a dog or a child or poor internet, and that we work together with employees to get through this period together. And maybe the output isn't quite what you would normally get if they were at work, but if it's reasonable for what we can expect in the current circumstances, then that, you know, should be recognised. I think one of the people, well, there's a couple of questions around what if for whatever reason, based on performance previously, you don't trust an employee to work from home productively. To our, I guess, IR specialist, Belinda and Alex, is there a point at which you say, well, the trust is broken and I don't have to offer you that kind of work, or you must still attend the workplace, even if they think there's a risk in terms of their health and safety?
Belinda, you want to answer that one?
Yep, okay. So, look, I think at the end of the day, it's a work situation. So if a person's not performing and a person isn't delivering what's being expected of them in a workforce scenario, then they should still be dealt with. We shouldn't stand back from that. There needs to be the conversations with them around why they are not performing, why they're not doing what you require of them. And if they still continue to do that, if they're not, giving you updates on a daily basis, if they're not completing pieces of work that you've given them, you should still deal with it as you would do if that person was back in an office situation working next to everybody else. So it's about setting those very clear requirements of what you expect of the workforce. And then if, unfortunately, there may be some employees who breach the trust and are down at the beach and aren't necessarily doing what you want them to do, and you become aware of it, it's dealing with it as a performance issue, just like you would if they was in an office.
Thanks, Belinda. And I guess to follow up from that, what obligation or what should the employer's response be if you think employees are disobeying the government's social distancing guidelines or not staying at home, or there's some other sort of breach? It may not be directly related to their work, but do you think that they're maybe breaking the laws or the social expectations that are out there at the moment? Is that the employer's responsibility at all?
I'll answer that one, Nadia.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it's difficult because generally out of hours conduct not directly related to work cannot be the subject of disciplinary action in the workplace. So here I think that the connection is indirect, incidental, and therefore I think it would be hard to use that as a trigger to discipline an employee, and particularly to go through a process of termination. I think in the current environment, a reminder to all our staff, all our family, all our friends of what the expectations are around social distancing and other risk minimisation measures is important and should always be kind of stressed. But I think it would be hard to go through a formal disciplinary process at this time.
And what's the employer's responsibility in terms of workplace health and safety at home, and also in terms of providing equipment, say around like an office desk or chair, internet?
Generally, if employers facilitate work from home arrangements, they are required to ensure the workplace health and safety of their employees. So that will, in the ordinary course, necessitate home inspections to make sure that the workstation is appropriate, there's ergonomically designed chairs, there's appropriate resources, etc. There's internet connection. These are extraordinary times, and the rate at which these issues are being implemented is meaning that all those usual measures are not necessarily being followed to the T. And sometimes these arrangements are put in place subject to the employees providing home IT, providing internet access at their cost as a mechanism to keep them engaged, because the alternative for many of these employees is that they go on leave without pay, and employers are doing all they can within reason to try and avoid those eventualities and the negative financial impact that will have on the individuals.
That one organisation's had some discussions around hiring a childcare worker and starting a daycare at work, and is this something other companies are looking at? I will speak to this one, and it hasn't been something that's specifically come up in relation to COVID, but it is something that I'm aware that some employers have looked at previously, where they have a large number of employees or key people who are employees who, you know, have caring responsibilities, young children. And myself personally, when I had my son, I took my son to work 2 days a week, and our business put in place certain arrangements, including a family room where feeding could occur, expressing, and those sort of things. I'm also aware of a business in Logan in Brisbane, an accounting firm that established its own creche and provides that to both clients and to their employees to be able to do that. So it is certainly possible. It's something you need to be careful about in terms of licensing and duty of care, but it's definitely something that's worth looking into if that can mean your business can continue its continuity. If you, and this might be an issue for sort of following medical advice more than industrial advice, but if you have one member of your team that does contract COVID-19, would all staff then need to be quarantined, assuming they were in physical contact with them, I guess?
Yeah, I saw a question related to that was worker grouping. So my understanding of the medical requirements is in a workplace setting, if a person is diagnosed positively with COVID-19, then those employees that certainly had direct contact with them at the workplace would be required to self-isolate for the period of 14 days. What some organisations are doing currently to reduce the risk of entire work groups having to be removed and self-isolate in an environment where perhaps they can't work remotely is either making multidisciplinary teams, so splitting, you know, finance with HR, commercial, etc., or what I've seen in a factory operational setting is locking down set groups on set rosters. So set 7.6 hour day, 24-minute break where cleaning occurs, next 7.6 hours afternoon, 24 minutes night shift, etc. And those shifts being self-contained. So if there is an outbreak within a work group, it will be confined to that particular shift rotation.